I'm Kent Calder, the director of the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies here at SAIS, and would like to say just a few words of welcome. Delighted to see so many people with an interest in Mongolia, and I see little by little more coming in. And at the Reischauer Center, we're delighted to be able to host a program on Mongolia. Here at SAIS, over the years, we've been a part of the university, a part of SAIS that has taken a special interest, thanks first and foremost to the fact that for many years, Alicia Campi, who had a distinguished career with the Department of State, and then after she retired, she also spent several years here as a professor at SAIS. And as many of you know, also was president of the Mongolia Society for several years. And so we deeply appreciate the role that she had in establishing Mongolian studies and an interest in Mongolia here. Of course, I do want especially also to thank Monica Weller, who's going to moderate today's conference, who spent time in Mongolia and also has had a deep interest that helps to spearhead the activities that we continue to have relating to Mongolia. Personally, for myself, I've made 4 trips to Mongolia in the context of work on the transformation of the Eurasian political economy, the historic changes that we've seen over the last 30 years, and then the relationship to the evolution of Mongolian democracy and Mongolia's relationships with its third country neighbors. Particularly, of course, it has the 2 large neighbors of Russia and China, but then beyond that, the third neighbors, of course, over the years since the United States in 1987 established relations. Those ties also with Japan, with a range of other nations. Third countries have also, of course, been important, and I'm sure that we'll see much discussion of that. Just a word or two before I briefly introduce the panel, and then I'll let Monica proceed from there. A few words about the broader regional context that I've been especially interested in. Did 2 books, The New Continentalism and Supercontinent, that relate to that transformation, particularly since China's 4 modernizations began at the end of 1978. One big driver, of course, of the way that Eurasia, the continent as a whole, and then Mongolia within it, has changed, has been that steady and massive growth of China itself. But then in the end of the 1980s, finalized, of course, rather dramatically with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, major changes in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of a more plural Eurasia, with so many countries, of course, across Central Asia becoming independent. And then after that, of course, the transformations steadily that we've seen within Russia itself. The 2008 financial crisis had a major impact with Mongolia and many of the other resource nations haven't been so dependent on raw material exports and so on. And then, of course, big changes that we have seen in relationships across the continent. First, the major summit between Russia and China in 2022 at the Beijing, just after the Beijing Winter Olympics, and then, of course, the Ukraine war and the transformation since then. So the continent has changed, has become much more interactive in a variety of ways, strikingly so, than it has since the early 1990s, as of course our speakers who have been directly involved in that process know so well and better than I. But I think it's worthwhile putting that in the context of this topic as a whole, which is Mongolian diplomacy and development, small power balancing in a divided world. And today we have 4 people, plus of course our moderator, Monica Miller, who really are so well placed to discuss that dualism, the transformation of the Eurasia, but more importantly, and the focus, of course, on Mongolia itself, and the way that it's changed, the way that it's responded to those difficult geopolitical situation that it's faced. First of all, Ambassador Piper Campbell, who's the inaugural chair of the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security at the American University here in Washington. She has a distinguished career in the State Department. Monica will elaborate more, but most importantly, of course, ambassador to Mongolia. Secondly, we have Mr. Ide Galbata, who is the operations officer with one of the major international financial institutions here in Washington, who can speak to the financial and economic dimensions of that transformation. Balor Lokjav, who is with the diplomat. Of course, many of us read that very often, and but also is very well versed and knowledgeable about transformation in Mongolia. And then finally, my colleague, Ambassador David Scheer, who has served in a number of distinguished positions in the US government, including Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian Pacific Security Affairs, also Ambassador to Vietnam, but also, and he'll elaborate more, has a range of experiences in Mongolia, but also served as the Mongolia desk officer and director of the China desk and a range as deputy assistant secretary, a range of State Department positions that also related to Mongolia. So we've got a distinguished panel. We've got a tremendously important subject, and we're delighted to have both a distinguished panel and all of you here. So thank you very much. Monica, it's all yours, and we're delighted that everyone's here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Calder, for that wonderful introduction. I'll have our panelists come up soon, but I'd like to say thank you to the audience for being here. I lived in Mongolia on a Fulbright, and so being able to kind of continue Mongolia studies and move forward with this and have 4 wonderful panelists, all with expertise in Mongolia and the greater region. I'm excited to present them to you today and look forward to having an interesting discussion. But if you'd like to all come up now, we'll have it. We know that Mongolia isn't always the most well-known country, so we have an idea of basically starting off on a broader geopolitical kind of situation and framework, and then honing in on the specific development and diplomatic situation of Mongolia. And so we'll start off with a round of questions regarding that. So if you all are ready, let's move forward. And then starting off with Mongolia, what would you describe Mongolia's current situation within the greater world as? Just to start off quite broad, and anyone's welcome to answer.
Maybe I'll start with a broad framing which builds on Dr. Calder's comments about the supercontinent. And within that were comments about the relationship between Russia and China. And it's interesting to think about how Mongolia is better able to balance, and traditionally has been better able to balance when Russia and China were in competition with each other, because that competition between Russia and China gave Mongolia some bargaining space. And so, but however, although Mongolia had that bargaining space during a relatively long period of time, 20-25 years, when their primary economic relationship, they imported so much from Russia, including getting almost all of their gas supply from Russia. And so a strong relationship there, and also a surprisingly strong cultural relationship between Mongolia and Russia. Even today, Russia is in opinion surveys in Mongolia, Russia is deemed to be the most reliable and trustworthy partner, which for me, when I arrived in Mongolia in 2012, was a real surprise. But when you go out in the countryside, when you engage with Mongolians, there's, in many cases, there's sort of a nostalgia for some of the safety nets that existed during the Russian period. So those are sort of some of the basics of Mongolia's relationship with Russia. Very different relationship with China, where there's some cultural animosity and even, I would say, at times racism on both sides, Mongolia towards China, China towards Mongolia. The tensions of the whole question around the Chinese treatment of Mongolians living in Inner Mongolia, but also the economic dependency that Mongolia has, because China is the primary consumer of Mongolian goods, and that gives China tremendous economic leverage, so that when China wants to punish Mongolia, say for example, hosting the Dalai Lama, closing the border for just a few days has had a tremendous impact on the Mongolian economy. And so you have very different dynamics in those two relationships. Mongolia fares best when they can deal those two off against each other and bring in what Mongolia calls third neighbors. So the countries they wish were right next door. And the United States has traditionally been one of the leading third neighbors. I think we're seeing all three aspects of that triangular relationship in flux at the moment. And I think that's one of the key things we'll probably find ourselves addressing during this panel.
And with that kind of brief intro, talking more specifically about, and actually Dr. Alicia Campy talked a lot about this in her book, Mongolian Foreign Policy, but could anyone speak more to the third neighbor policy and what countries that includes and what role it plays? And then, yeah.
Thank you, Monica. That's a really important question. When we're talking about Mongolia's foreign policy, I like to put it in multiple sections. Okay, so when we could talk about Mongolia's foreign policy, how it was before the 1990s, and then what happened after 1990s, right? And in our current time, Mongolia has been implementing what is called a multi-pillared foreign policy approach, which one of the major element is the third neighbor foreign policy. What is the third neighbor foreign policy? It actually involves the two neighbors. You have strong ties with Russia and China in order to get to the third neighbors, right? The concept itself was you could say it was derived from conceptually historical, because Mongolia has always sought outward. It was never a inward country that's looking inside. It's always trying to reach greater access point beyond the Russia and China borders. And then when you put it into practice, when you materialize it, it comes into bilateral relations, multilateral relations, joining multilateral organizations, which all are part of that third neighbor foreign policy. And then we could narrow it down to specific countries, Mongolia-US relations, Mongolia-Japan relations, recent strategic partnerships. What does it mean to have a comprehensive strategic partnership with Mongolia, Russia, Mongolia, and China? So I think at that point, Mongolian third neighbor foreign policy is really a multi-pillared platform that includes economic, political, social, military, security, people to people. It's really a all platform. That's what I would say. Anybody wants to add to that?
Thank you. I'm not a Mongolia expert, but I've worked on Mongolia in a variety of contexts throughout my career. And one question that always occurred to me was, why, of what interest is it to the United States to be a third neighbor of Mongolia? After all, Mongolia is sandwiched there, it's landlocked, it's sandwiched there between Russia and China. It has a population of 3 million plus people. So why is it in the United States' interest for us to have a strong relationship with Mongolia? And the answer I always gave to myself was that if the United States is going to place a higher level of strategic importance on the Indo-Pacific, and I view Mongolia as being part of the Indo-Pacific region. If the United States is going to put a higher priority on the Indo-Pacific, and if the United States continues to want a free and open Indo-Pacific, then that must apply also to Mongolia. And it benefits us because it adds another potentially democratic partner to our list of allies and partners. It demonstrates to the region that we are going to be engaged in the whole region, and that gives other countries in the region more leverage, more room to maneuver themselves. So I've always thought it's critically important for us to be engaged in Mongolia, despite the small size of its population, despite the fact that it's landlocked. I think we should be in there plugging away.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I think all my fellow panelists captured this policy beautifully, especially the Ambassador Campbell gave like a very good overview on this. So in my view, the third neighbor policy has like two main requirements. What country do we name our third neighbors? One, it should be the developed countries, like a strong economically and politically strong country. And two, it should be the democratic political system. That's the main two requirements where the Mongolian foreign policy approach to the third neighbor policy. Having said that, the US is the strongest or the most strategic important third neighbor to Mongolia. So Ambassador Campbell mentioned how we also think it's true that for us, the relationship between Russia and Mongolia and China. So historically, at some point, Mongolia used to follow the same political system with our neighbors. When we do that, we were under control and we were more like under the dark for a long time. If you say so, like in the Manchu, not China, but it's a Manchu, we were under the Manchu control for 200 years. And after that, under the Soviet Union, we were like almost 70 years. But we had the window to change that narrative into connect to the world. Like Apollo mentioned, we wanted to approach the world from the outside of our neighbors. That's how we did it through the democracy. So it's more like a democracy's Mongolian independence. And this is the way we try to approach to the world and then meet people and develop, at least get into the sit on the table to say people to people relationship, hey, this is my country, and we trying to promote the democracy. So we switched our political system in a peaceful way, so without a single drop of blood, So that's the very, as a Mongolian, I'm very proud of. We went through that peaceful transition.
Thank you so much, Idre. And then going off of that, obviously Mongolia does have a lot of neighbors, whether immediate neighbors or those third neighbor countries. But how much leverage does Mongolia actually have in managing those relationships? And in particular, obviously Mongolia has tried to have some strategic partnerships with the US in the past, but how durable is that compared to the push of its immediate neighbors like Russia and China that control so much of its energy as well as its economic power?
That's a difficult one, but I'll try. When we talk about Mongolia's foreign policy and how we're navigating between the two large powers, I'd like to look at it from small state perspective, how small states manage these growing challenges. How do small states balance between two large powers? And one of the term that we use in international relations is hedging. Mongolia does hedge, and I think in a way, but it's very selective. What is the national interest? What is the national goal, right? So when you're thinking about what are the leverages, what does Mongolia want? What does Mongolia want from Russia? What does Mongolia want from China? What does Mongolia specifically want from these third neighbors? And does that impact the relationship between Mongolia and Russia? Does Mongolia have to hedge? What's the give and take? You can't take and take, and it's not give and give either. So I think Mongolia is balancing a very difficult, challenging foreign policy navigations. But in my view, I think Mongolia is doing it very cleverly by, like I said, being very selective. I don't think that like you can apply Mongolia's third neighbor foreign policy to each countries because, like I said, it's very selective. So I'm gonna give an example of the US because, you know, we're in the US. Since establishing diplomatic relations, I think one of the things that the Mongolia wanted from the US, and this is a Mongolia's view, not the US view, because, you know, we're looking at it from small state view, is that what can a developing super country give to Mongolia? Is there something that we can learn from the US? Is there something that the US can help us develop to strengthen civil society, to defend our human rights and constitution? So these are the things that are not leverageable, I think, because what are the principles of Mongolia's democracy is you have the people remains to have strong voice and you want to have a governance, stable governance. So I think especially when we're talking about small state strategy, there's not much to leverage, and the way Mongolia is doing it is being very, very selective. That's what I would say.
I think first and foremost, it's a security. So, and as a small state, we have to keep our independence to at least try to balance between these two neighbors, superpowers, you know, both sides. And economically, I don't think it's that much if we put that number on the like world stage. We do have some leverage in the economy, bringing like you told about like a third neighbor investment into our ground. Now it's a uranium mining, like from the Paris Agreement, from France. So then those kind of economic leverages still we're trying to use it, but still it's a very small. We're talking about like a 1.7 billion like amount of dollars. So of course it's compared to the world, it's a small, but for most and the first I think it's a securities how we is trying to approach.
I want to go way back in time to tell a story that kind of gets to this point. It's the year 2001. Piper Campbell is a junior officer serving at the US mission to the UN in New York. And my job is to manage the President of the United States, George W. Bush, who's in New York for his first UNGA. Immediately after UNGA has been delayed because of the attack on the United States. He's meant to have a 5-minute pull aside with the Mongolians because the Mongolians have something that they want to give to him. And then he has a meeting scheduled with the French. The 5-minute meeting becomes a 10-minute meeting, becomes a 15-minute meeting, becomes a 20-minute meeting. George Bush is entranced with his conversation with Mongolia. They give him a stamp, which the Mongolians have printed already, saying, "We stand with America in its hour of need." They are one of the first countries to commit that they're going to respond with the United States. And he walked out of that meeting, the president of the United States, keeping the French waiting, walked out of the meeting and turned to Condoleezza Rice and he said, "That's the best meeting I've had so far in this General Assembly." And I mention that because when we think about leverage, I think it's often so easy to answer with statistics and to think about it in sort of real power terms. But I also think that some of the power of Mongolia is the power of its story. It's the power of the pride of the people of Mongolia and their culture. It's the fact that Mongolia is sort of one of the few remaining exotic, fantastic places in the world. People want to go there. You know, senior officials want to have a chance to go to Mongolia to see it, to understand it. And when they see it, they very often fall in love and come back and are proponents of this sort of not so young anymore, but this like feisty democracy fighting in a tough area of the world. I know just this week, the Mongolian Secretary of Defense was in Hawaii meeting with Admiral Rudd from Indo-PACOM. And I think the strength of relationships, like the defense to defense relationship, are a really important part of and continue to be an important part of the Mongolia story.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Just to follow up. Just to follow up on what Piper just said, you can look at the statistics and you can look at Mongolia's geopolitical position vis-a-vis Russia and China, and you can make the conclusion that Mongolia has almost no aggregate leverage vis-a-vis either of these powers. But the fact is that you can bring tremendous leverage to bear on individual issues. If you have good diplomats, if you have big partners, third neighbors on your side, and if you are shamelessly persistent. You have to look beyond the aggregate statistics, your perception of aggregate leverage to look at how well Mongolia has done in specific areas. And I think it's safe to say that they've done pretty well so far.
Oh, I would agree with that, and I think that part of this is also that Mongolia doesn't fit neatly into a lot of, you know, US's geopolitical sanctions. It is North Asia, it falls into the Indo-Pacific, but again, it's definitely quite different than most of the other. Okay, sorry, apologies, but yeah, I would say Mongolia doesn't fit neatly into those geopolitical boxes. It is technically East Asia, it is North Asia, but you don't often think of North Asia as a branch, but it's also not grouped in with Central Asia. And so because of that, I think that allows Mongolia to have more influence because it is often grouped as the only country in its region. And actually building off of that, because there is that interest, because Mongolia is able to present itself as this feisty, you know, horse-loving democracy, what would you say is kind of Mongolia's ability to kind of get that development aid? And what would you say kind of the development situation in terms of the investments from abroad? You mentioned Oyu Tolgoi, the big mine, but also what investments are going into Mongolia?
I will like to say something about what you said about the geography, because I think that's really important. One of the things that I really like to think about Mongolia is that you could put Mongolia in Northeast Asia, you're basically talking about Russia and China and Mongolia, right? Okay, maybe North Korea. If you put Mongolia in East Asia, then Mongolia's third parties are, you know, you're including Japan, South Korea. Then you go out to Indo-Pacific. If you look at it geographically, Mongolia is nowhere near the Indo-Pacific. So that's part of the third neighbor strategies to make Mongolia's foreign policy more than its geographical limitations and Tim Marshall, right, the book called The Prisoners of Geography, Mongolia does not want to become the prisoner of geography, right? So thinking outside the box, looking for investment in specific sectors from those parties are really, really important. And when you talk about development projects, I just wanted to bring up one main thing was that each sector, I feel like it's a little bit depend on that selective third party partnership. What is Russia offering, for example? What is China offering? What's China's economic goal and how can Mongolia benefit from that? So aligning certain projects, certain development into other countries' vision have benefited Mongolia for the long term, but also that brings challenges of investment, over dependency. So maybe the experts can add into that.
For development, I think I cannot speak for the Mongolian government because I'm way outside. So I think I'm sure if someone in the government can tell you like a very specific pressure how they receive from the website, but looking at the happening from outside, for example, I mentioned that the French government we signed a deal with the Orona mining, so it actually comes with the two different deals, like not necessarily come with together, but if you see the bigger, like what's happening around there is one is we also signed almost the same kind of amount of big deal with the Russia. It's just renovating the power plant area. So basically the amount of the investment is almost the same. And then also we had signed on the railroad connection in our southern side. So if you look at it, it's like combine all of those, Mongolia is trying to leverage, but at the same time, I feel like there's a pressure on both sides and our neighbors' interest in it. So but the development side, I think the ambassadors foreign aid or the more in development and aid part, I think the ambassador Campbell will have more.
And Ambassador Campbell, actually, I think that this might be kind of a question looming in the room as well, but if you could specifically talk to how the apparent closure of US aid and American foreign aid will impact Mongolia, in addition to what Edith said.
And a bit, that's still an open question, right? Because we know what we see in the paper on a day-to-day basis. We know that USAID personnel have been, their stop orders have been issued. People have been told not to work, go to work, etc. We know the statements of the moment. Just to provide, and I would take the position that if the cessation of USAID programs moves ahead the way that it appears that it is going to, that would be extremely problematic for the United States in terms of meeting the US interests in Mongolia and more broadly in the region. And I think that almost everybody who has worked in the foreign affairs space, who has worked with employees from USAID, and who has seen how important USAID is and the various sectors in which USAID, both American and locally employed staff work in support of these sort of shared objectives, is very, very concerned about what's going on right now. Specifically related to Mongolia, the United States and Mongolia have worked together in two different development programs. The first being the U.S. Agency for International Development, the second being the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So MCC and USAID have both had programs in Mongolia over time. I was there during the first MCC Compact, which was a multi-year program negotiated with the government of Mongolia to meet sort of these agreed needs in areas like building a new road from the capital to the southeast border. There is a second Millennium Challenge Compact going on right now, which is focused on water, sewage, energy, etc. Right now in Mongolia, there are 3 USAID programs. And I'm going to just highlight what the areas are, because I think that they speak to why these are just common sense, good programs. The first is in energy governance. And so in a country which has real challenges in terms of how the energy sector operates, energy governance is clearly important and also creates opportunities for a number of the US companies that are currently resident in Mongolia. The second is business excellence for sustainability and transparency. And again, Mongolia does have problems with corruption in the business sector. Those problems in the business sector have made it harder for US companies to engage in Mongolia. And so this is a program which is good for Mongolia and also good for the United States. It has received significant support from the American Chamber of Commerce in Mongolia. And in fact, two of the American implementing partners for that program are members of the American Chamber of Commerce in Mongolia. And the third is media and civil society strengthening. These are the types of programs that USAID does around the world. These three programs are all tightly focused on things which are extremely important in moving Mongolia forward in the strength of its democracy, in the strength of its ability to resist sometimes insidious Chinese and Russian influence on the political system through engagement with oligarchs, through let's say backroom deals. So that's what these programs address.
So that could go in a lot of different ways, but Mongolia is a democracy. It has its challenges and it continues to have those challenges, but would you say that there's increasing pressures on Mongolian democracy from when they had their peaceful revolution back in the 1990s?
Yes, in short, because Mongolia, and when it comes to the democracy, there are two things. One is you have the free speech, and two, it's more the economic prosperity. So in Mongolia, we had, in terms of human rights, also the free speech, we had the cases the last few years, it's become like more monitored, feels like the public feels the voices become more monitored, or you have more contact with the government or the public officials. So that's actually that the public start feeling it, and that also helps to that if there's a third interest in it, and you can use that the media or social media to push your agenda into by the controlled way. So I would say that kind of feeling is actually more aggressive than before, in my opinion. So that's what I feel. So in the economy side, I think in fact the Mongolian government is now expanding more into the business, doing more business by the government itself. So and there's a shrink in the private sector, and if you look at the government spending at the same time, the state-owned enterprises, those are like really alarming numbers in terms of the free market and more like a prosperous business environment. However, I went to Mongolia last summer and participated in our last parliamentary election. So the one thing I witnessed was the organizing our democratic election was very successful. So we organized, I think the election committee did a great job to organizing entire election without any major cases. And I think the result was transparent, and the result was immediate, fast, and everyone double checked that there's no gap between the result versus expectations. And we also, I wanted to say that the last election was the first time we elected it's actually the parliament, this number of member of parliaments actually expanded from 76 to 126. So that was now we have more member representatives of the public, the member of parliament, and we elected, I think, 50 of them elected from the list, and the rest it's elected from the public. So we had very holistic results from that election, and I was really happy to see that at least we doing our election process is actually in a good shape. But of course, the governing is a different one.
Thank you, Dre. So when you're talking about Mongolia's democracy, I was just thinking about the passing of Mongolia's first democratically elected president, which also says a lifetime has passed, 35 years. What Mongolia has accomplished, has Mongolia's democracy enhanced, is it backsliding? How are the growing authoritarianism, not just in East Asia, but in the world, is influencing Mongolia? And I'd like to maybe narrow it down to 3 main points, just so we could talk about it specifically. I think the growing trend on authoritarianism will impact Mongolia in some ways, but I think it's also how Mongolia is fighting these pressures, right? So for example, if Russia and China continues to become a state-owned, monitoring its citizens, how will Mongolia react to that? You brought up media coverages, media free speech needs to be in place in Mongolia in order for the Mongolian population to stay democratic. Election is also one major thing, governance. We elected the first time largest, democratically elected parliamentaries, and talking to scholars and people in the field, this parliamentary has been the most diverse and intellectually capable. Now, when I say intellectually capable, what do I mean is the people are actually expertise and specialties in their fields. So when they produce some sort of a law or amendment, it's actually supporting that sector, right? The second thing that I'd like to highlight is corruption, and this is something that we can't neglect. We look at international indexes, the corruption number does not go down. I think the government has been trying to tackle the lower level of corruption by digital development. Digitalization does help with lower level of corruption, but the high level corruption remains a major issue. And a lot of it has to do with the state-owned enterprises. That's one of the issues. The second is transparency. Financial transparency is not there. And you can see it not just from international reports, but from individual countries, right? So for example, US State Department had a 2024 climate investment agreement, a report. One of the things their concern was transparency and corruption, right? So if there is a sign of corruption, then most likely countries are not gonna invest in the sectors that they really believe in. And lastly, I would like to say that the diversity is really the strength of Mongolia's government and governance right now, is because of those representatives represent different sectors. I hope that the government continues to include people's concern as part of their governance and to move forward more democratically. And you brought up media too, is that I think that's part of the reason that, as for me, as a writer and researcher, I'd like to write about multiple angles. I don't want to just talk about the Mongolian government. I also want to write about what Mongolian people think or what their really concerns are. And yeah.
Ambassador Xu?
Thank you. I sense there's a great deal of skepticism in the new administration about democracy promotion, supporting good governance and the rule of law, that constellation of values in our foreign assistance. And I want to make the strongest possible case for continuing to do that with Mongolia. If the highest value in Mongolian foreign policy is preservation of its independence, and if the Mongolian people chose to become a democracy because it believed it enhanced their independence and enhanced their attractiveness to potential third neighbors in the West, then the best thing that we can be doing to support Mongolia's independence vis-a-vis Russia and China is supporting its democracy, supporting transparency and the rule of law and good governance in Mongolia. These are not only good business propositions, they are good hard power propositions.
Here.
Totally, 100%.
Well said. Thinking about that and kind of culminating, I think what might be important to also talk about is what are the biggest constraints on sustainable economic growth and just growth and development of democracy? Just what issues there are. I mean, more than half the population lives in the capital city, and for what I believe is the 8th biggest country in the world by land mass, to have the least densely populated country and more than half the population in one city feels unsustainable, but there's a lot of differences between that. So if you can just comment on any of the challenges.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And besides corruption and let's say the mining curse and everything, the natural resource curse, and in my opinion, it lends to the two things. One, it's a population, because we are very small, like a 3.3 million, right? As of, the 2023. And half of them, there's almost 1 million people who's actively working. And the rest, it's we have elderly and kids, and we have also people in the social welfare system as well. So then the driving the economy course, that's the driver of that community is 1/3, which is very low. Second, if we look at our democracy, we changed it and we become a more open country to the world. Let's say you were 30 years old. Right now, you are 65, after 35 years of democracy, then still you're not reached to the retirement age yet. If I was an uneducated person in 35 years ago, it's still, I'm choosing where I used to be before my 30s, right? So that actually, having said that, education is the second biggest thing. So we need to educate, we need to get we need more access to the Western education system to get the knowledge and to know-hows and bring back to the Mongolia. So I used to work at the US Embassy in Mongolia as an alumni coordinator. Basically, my main job was work with the Mongolians who studied in America under the US government scholarships. And when they get back to home, and I organized events and helped them share what they learned from America into the Mongolian community. So there I saw it's a people-to-people tie, like a relationship. And Ambassador Sher mentioned that it's a very individual relationship is also important. It's creating a people-to-people tie, also the bringing in knowledge, getting access to the libraries. Those are very important areas. And also one thing on both sides, the Mongolia and the US government can do, in my opinion, is increase the number of people studying in the US and also the number of people who travel back and forth to the tourism. So in the study side, especially for the longer term and undergrad type of scholarships are important to educate the Mongolians. That's it. Because if you say you're under this different political system, then out of nowhere you just changed it, then in 1990s everyone were very poor. It's really hard to pay the US university's tuition as a parent. If I send my if I send my kid to the US, one of the university, it's really hard for me to pay that. So those kind of access to the libraries are important factor. So I think that's also one of the factors: population and education.
I'd like to take the answer in a slightly different direction. And first, to start off with some good news, which is that the first US airline is going to be flying to Ulaanbaatar starting this summer. And in fact, it's going to be United Airlines with a flight through Tokyo. So anybody who's intrigued by what you're hearing, you have increased opportunity to travel to Mongolia. And that's something that the Mongolians and the United States have been working on for a number of years. It was part of the comprehensive strategic partnership, was simultaneously the announcement that the US and Mongolia would be working on all those small, behind the scenes things which go into creating the authorizations and the understandings that allow for something like a US airline to fly into a Mongolian airport. The other way I wanted to answer the question, though, is to focus a little bit on Oyu Tolgoi. As Itere mentioned, Oyu Tolgoi is a copper and gold mine, which is located in southern Mongolia in the Gobi Desert. It's one of the largest copper mines in the world. I think it's the third largest copper mine in the world. It has both it started with an open pit portion, which means you just basically dig out what the concentrate, what you're seeking to capture, and create a bigger and bigger pit. But then at the same time, they added what's called an underground mine, where you basically dig under the ore, and then you explode the ceiling and the ore falls down into the underground. So they do black pit mining there. And the underground portion is where the most of the ore is. And that's been basically in full production for the last 2 years. And the results are really impressive in that this year, the copper concentrate production was 60% more than 2 years ago, 22% more than last year. This is a major source, worldwide source of copper and gold. And that is, in general, excellent news for Mongolia right now. I say in general because as Itere alluded to, there are environmental and other concerns around having a product like this in your country. The other thing is that there's only probably 11, 12 years worth of copper concentrate left in Oyu Tolgoi. And so this is a major infusion into the Mongolian economy for the next, let's say, 10 to 12 years, and then it's gone. And so, like many other countries, it's really important that Mongolia is recognizing that this is a short-term infusion into the economy and being strategic about how it uses that infusion to invest in other sectors, to perhaps and to educate people and to be thinking to the future. So that's going to be, I think, one of the most interesting things to watch about Mongolia over the next 2 decades.
Yeah, I actually agree with Ambassador Campbell on many of the things that she said. When you're talking about resource course, though, I was thinking about like competing partnerships, right? So Mongolia we have so much vast natural resources, but we're also competing with so many of the other countries. Kazakhstan is leading uranium, right? Idre was talking about Mongolia-France-Orano deal, how that could change Mongolia's mining sector, but mostly in terms of diversification of those investors into Mongolia, because Ambassador Campbell said Rio Tinto is gonna go away after the copper's done, but when you have, what are you gonna do with all those people? They need a job, so maybe they could go to uranium sector. So it is important for Mongolia to not repeat the resource curse, but use it as a way to learn and enhance the human capacity so that knowledge and know-how stays within the country and applied to different scenarios, which is really important. And when you're talking about sustainable economic growth, I was thinking about also like infrastructure too, is that like during 1990s, I was born in 88, so I didn't know this happened. I learned it way later, but we didn't have the infrastructure to connect all the 21 provinces. But now you go to Mongolia, you can drive to all of the, provinces, more or less, right? With good pavements, and then like you have the like roads. But in terms of, you look at from all these developments in 35 years, they are changes, but they are also remaining challenges, right? So one of the things that Mongolia is doing is to really focus on diversifying ways to tackle these issues. And I think some of the some of the things that you can see, other things will take really, really long time, like the current government's Vision 2050 has 14 mega projects. That will take a long time, you know, I don't think this in 6 years is gonna happen, so I think as long as the grassroots projects have started, the investments are flowing in, I think they do have a chance. But again, if Mongolia is constantly sticking with mining, and then we'll have to deal with environmental degradations in 10-20 years, and do we actually know what's gonna happen with Rio Tinto after they leave? Do they have a plan to restore the land? And I know there is Australia's Queensland University has a lot of research on environmental degradation. So I think this is something that a sector that needs to further develop, that people really need to speak out, because Mongolians we're close to our land, motherland, fatherland, so it does not matter if you're seeking for investment for 10-20 years, what are you gonna do with the land that's used? So I think that's really important to avoid the resource curse.
For what it's worth, my understanding is that the US and Mongolia concluded a memorandum of understanding on mineral supply chains in 2023. I'm not so familiar with the content of that MOU, but I think that's a good step forward. And perhaps even more interesting, the US, the ROK and Mongolia have begun a trilateral dialogue on rare minerals as well, which I think is very important. And it also puts Mongolia squarely in the sort of mini-lateral diplomatic context that we've been building in the Indo-Pacific for the past 10 years. And in addition to that, on the strategic side, I also believe we have a trilateral US-Japan-Mongolia strategic dialogue at the Assistant Secretary level, which I think will be important to continuing follow up on.
For that, I think it is important to kind of know how those other relationships are shaping, and obviously minerals and mining is a key part of Mongolia's economy, but it has also led to a series of boom and bust cycles. And so in terms of reaching that Vision 2050, how sustainable is that? Has Mongolia's economy been shaping itself or trying to reach out to other industries, and have any of those efforts been successful? If anyone's willing to comment.
Yeah, statistically, we have since democracy, I just crunched a few numbers and how we doing it. So there are like two trends. I saw it in economic growth versus our when we had a coalition government, we signed the Ayutthaya. So then now we have a coalition government and we signed the Orona. So I think that's kind of indication of how the governments actually they influence to the like bring a third neighbors into the our economic system. So and Mongolian. I'm sorry, I just lost the past part of the question.
Just kind of thinking about what other sectors that Mongolia may be branching into.
Yeah, so in terms of sector, I think first thing I think when I come to the US, I noticed there's a very few people know about the Mongolia. So, and when we in Mongolia, everyone is, of course, it's in your country, and you think yourself, Mongolia is everyone knows about the Mongolia. But when you come to the America, it's like, especially the general public doesn't know anything. I mean, it's very little. So I think the first Mongolia is another sector. I think the tourism is a very big sector, but to do that, we need more awareness to like what is Mongolia, at least where it's located and what's the political system and how we function things. So I think right now the government is more focusing on, I think, the awareness campaign, as I saw that, because the last month in Davos, I saw the Mongolian had only the first time the Mongolian house in the Davos trying to promote just general Mongolia. There's a country and we operate in between the Russia and China, and hey, this is what we do. This is like what our like land looks like, and just if you want to do the business, just talk to us. Those kind of things. So, but in the long run, I think in terms of sustainability, I think the tourism is a very important sector, and at the same time, I would say invest in education. So
Yeah, please.
I was gonna say, we didn't touch on renewable energy and public health at all. These two are very, very important. And it's not just because of air pollution, just public health, even in the States, it's a big industry, right? So I think, I don't remember the company name, but I think South Korea is looking into medicine and public health in Mongolia, which I think is a great partnership. EU is also looking into public health. You know, European Union has high standards of agriculture and food quality. Renewable energy is definitely a growing sector, and I think all of Mongolia's foreign partners are pushing Mongolia to allocate funding and investment into renewable energies, particularly battery storage, you know, wind, solar panels, and something that can be start from little household to a big building up to like bigger infrastructure. As I said earlier, these will take longer time, but I think if you were to start from the GER district, you're trying to tackle air pollution, public health, and renewable energy. I think it's a great start. You have to start from little to the bigger projects. So I think these industries are growing, and with Mongolia's technologically advancing society, I think technology is also an increasingly important field.
And then I think we haven't necessarily branched the topic, but obviously pollution is a major issue in the capital city, just given that I think about 60% of the population lives in GER districts, which are the traditional Mongolian felt houses or a yurt, where they're typically connected to electricity, but they don't have running water or heat. And if you assume that Ulaanbaatar in the winter gets to negative 40 degrees below Celsius or Fahrenheit, same thing, then it's quite cold, and people need to stay warm. And I think I read a statistic that a single family living in a GER can burn about 5 kilos of coal a day. And if you assume 60% of a city that has close to 1.5 million people living in it, and it's a small mountain valley, that's a significant amount. And there's been severe public health challenges in terms of that. But also, I think that there's instability in terms of herding as a sector. You've seen just goats taking over in the Kashmir, and so just having those unsustainable amounts, but also increasing winter storms like Zut, and things like that, and climate change overall. So I don't know if you do have the answers or any suggestions, and we did bring up renewable energy, but do you see any solutions or any awareness or any push by the government to really address these growing challenges, both human-made and through the environment?
On the pollution side, I think the Mongolian government is trying to fight the pollution in a very different types of like approach. So including we had the early stage, we had like MCC on it, and we tried to actually replace the stove itself, like to less like smoky stove in the GER district, and it's a very mechanical approach. But in general, right now, I think I don't really see this is my very personal opinion. I don't really see that like a very immediate solution for the pollution unless we wanted to diversify our cities and move the people like into build more cities and like a more economical areas where people want to live in this. And because like you said, it's really hard if your entire population lives in one city, and almost like 60% it's a massive. So then the congestion, like the traffic, it's everything, it's stress level, it's like huge. So then you like after the 5 minutes from escaping the city, you just see the like empty land. That's like, why do I like stay in the city and get stressed more or get polluted versus, because of course it's an economical decision. So as like you said, it's linked because Mongolia is a nomadic culture community, and when we once at a time, I think most of our parents or grandparents were herders. When they live in a nomadic lifestyle and the herding an animal, like a harsh winter, like a zud, actually kills all of your livestock. it's basically your economic like poverty level just from here to just like straight shoot down in a matter of 2 months. So that's really hard for anyone to get adapted in as a person and as an individual and as a family. So what they do, they seek the more economic opportunities. Where does it exist? Most likely in a city. So that's like how we created. I mean, that's like a kind of nature harsh winter plus. It's a combination of everything, but the one solution I would offer is we may have to look invest into like more different cities and more provinces, and then get attraction for the like a population to the like from capital to the more small cities.
Another thing that I would like to piggyback on what Indra said is infrastructure. I really I see air pollution as an infrastructure issue, because you've been to UB areas, and if you go outskirts, you don't have a road, you don't have clean water. The Gir district doesn't have electricity, right? And it's also the part that where Mongolians are trying to modernize, move away from the nomadic culture where you just pick up your car and move to a city, and that has continued for 30, 40 something years. So now we're dealing with air pollution. So if people continue to live that nomadic lifestyle in the city, then even at a city level, there has to be some sort of a regulation. And I know there are a lot of people who goes against regulation, they don't want to be regulated, but it needs to be regulated. And one of the things that could work is really focus on infrastructure, because I think it will be impossible for anybody to say, hey, you have to move now, because it's their home, maybe their children grow up there. So I think at a city level, they need to invest in infrastructure, at least give them clean water. And after infrastructure has been implemented, then you could provide a larger demand saying like, stop using coal. But I think it has a lot to do with the socioeconomic lifestyle too, because if you have a decent job, most likely you're not gonna live in Gir districts, you're poor, you're under the poverty line, that's where you are living. So a lot of the issue is a social issue that we're just seeing it as a symptom, right? So yeah, I would say put your money on infrastructure, fix it, then ban the coal. Otherwise, it's not gonna change.
And then, so we are getting close to that time, but I wanted to kind of go around and think about, in terms of final questions, what about Mongolia's future, both at kind of the domestic level, but also the international level? Where should they be investing? What partnerships should they be thinking about? Where should they be expecting or looking for support in the future, or how to support themselves?
I hope Mongolia will remain totally engaged with the United States, and I hope the United States has the foresight and the intelligence to continue engaging with Mongolia, because I think that's one of the most critical components of a successful future for Mongolian people. I'll leave it at that. And I was gratified to see that the Mongolian defense minister, I guess, had visited the Indo-PACOM command this week. So it looks to me like they are seeking reassurance, and and that we are, at least at the Indo-PACOM level, we are giving it to them.
Okay. So I think the Mongolia, I mean, we will be, and it will be. We've been here, and it's a Norwegian. The Mongolia as a nation, we will continue like existing, and in our like a foreign policy, using all our foreign policy at the same time economically, and people like Mongolia, I think in the long run, the democracy is like a very key part of our independence and existence. So, and that's the way we try to balance between the two neighbors. And then in that said, I had to make some call to prepare for this this panel to my friends in Mongolia. And how do you feel about in general now in democracy, and also what you see and that some of my friends said, I feel abandoned. Like, why? Then it's sometimes you see the broader like a democracy, like administration change, you see the like uncertain things happening. And especially the US, you see US as like a very the Northern Star and also your biggest philosophical third neighbor in terms of connecting to the democracy. So then if that's the case, then what should we do? So to continue to keep our existence, then it goes to we should do the more from the both side and the US side and then the Mongolian side. So I think, in my opinion, in the next few years, it's will be the very challenging times to test the Mongolian strength of the Mongolian democracy, as well as I think it's around the globe as well. So how we do that and how we survive, I think we should start more personal and people-to-people type connection with our neighbors plus our third neighbors as well. So how we do that through the education, then my solution is more like increasing the number of people who study and access the library access in the Western world. At the same time, I also want the people from the Western world to visit Mongolia in summertime. That's a beautiful time. So I mean, like Monica said, it's winter is a little bit, unpleasant, but we have, I mean, only one city though, but it's outside the city, it's beautiful. So, and come to Mongolia and meet people and just get to know, have a friends, Mongolian friends. So those kind of connection will actually, there will be the main holding lines for us to be existence and at the same time to strengthen our relationship with the different countries.
From more on the lines of international relations and foreign policy point of view, I think Mongolia will continue to implement its multi-pillared foreign policy. I don't see any other way. I think Mongolia will remain strongly close relations with Russia and China, and while attracting third neighbors. And this has always been the game. It's not a zero-sum game for Mongolia's foreign policy, so I don't expect anything too sudden. And foreign policy is not a field that you switch and flip-flop anyway, especially for a small country like Mongolia. And I'd like to see Mongolia moving forward with being a reliable global partner on a global stage, most importantly, not just in the region, but UN peacekeeping, education, multilateral organizations. What is Mongolia contributing to the world and with good intentions? I think that's mostly important on international relations. But when you bring those qualities back to Mongolia, that is the example of Mongolia's democratization. So I would be rooting for Mongolia to keep continuing whatever it's doing in terms of foreign policy and with its good intentions to keep Mongolia's national interest at hand. Thank you.
I think in the next decade, Mongolia's democracy is going to face some real internal challenges, including as Mongolians, both in the broader population and in the political level, look around and see some of these problematic trends in democracy and in democracies. And so some of that soul searching, some of that feeling of abandonment, some of that questioning around whether democratic paths are the correct path, or it is predictable that all of that will occur in Mongolia, especially during a period of time that Mongolia is economically becoming closer to China. We're seeing more Mongolian and Chinese economic projects, including something that was considered almost impossible when I was there a decade ago, which is building a new railroad directly between some of the primary coal producing areas in the south and the Chinese border. And a decade ago, the Mongolian people said, we don't want to do that because you build that railroad, even though you're building it to take things out of Mongolia, you're creating the path for China to come into Mongolia. today in Mongolia, the parliament actually approved that prop to move forward on that project. So in just a decade, it is interesting to see how Mongolian views about the possibilities of working with China have changed. And I think that dynamic, plus the dynamic that we've discussed around democracy, are going to be two of the primary factors. Both of those have me worried. What keeps me somewhat calm is that the world's gotten smaller. And I think we see that fact of a smaller world in so many ways on an almost daily basis. It's easier to connect with people elsewhere. It's easier for Americans to go to Mongolia, to learn about Mongolia, to become interested. It's easier for Mongolians to source and find ideas elsewhere that might be relevant to the Mongolian situation. And so I'm looking forward and seeing two worrying trends and one very positive trend.
This is slightly off the topic, but I would encourage everybody to watch for the result of Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba's visit today. I think the whole region will be watching this, including the Mongolians, for indications about where the Trump administration will be heading, not only on bilateral US-Japan relations, but on where we're headed for the region. So this will be a key visit and a key waypoint in the road to figuring out where the administration is going.
Well, thank you very much for that. There's a lot of issues that we haven't touched upon. Again, you mentioned the peacekeeping forces. Mongolia does play a huge role in having UN peacekeepers around the world. Mongolia also often acts as a peacekeeper or a peacemaker with North Korea and managing those delicate relations there. And there's a myriad of other topics that we haven't touched upon yet, but I did want to open up to potentially Dr. Calder and or Q&A.